This is an unusual camera review for me. It's not my usual movie length, still long. It covers a lot of stuff though, a lot of interesting things for me. And that is the thing that's unusual, is that I wasn't interested in this camera when it was first announced. And I only do reviews on cameras, products, anything that is of interest to me. I wasn't that taken with the Sony FX3 when it came out. For me it was a nice new body, nice XL handle, but where's the EVF? No EVF for me was a deal breaker. And also calling it cinema line, it didn't feel like a cinema line, didn't feel like the FX6 and FX9, only in that grey body. So when the FX30 was announced, which was the same thing, but with a smaller sensor, I just didn't think I was going to be interested at all. Didn't think I was going to like it at all. Well, I was wrong. There is a lot to talk about with the FX30. It also gives me a perfect chance to talk about the version 2 firmware for the FX3, which did make some substantial improvements to the camera. Not everything that it really should have had, but a fair amount. And these are all in the FX30, except the FX30 also has a lot more things in it as well. So I'm not going to cover everything about this camera, just the key stuff, and the biggest differences between it and the FX3. The FX30 is Sony's first APS-C camera in years. Let's call it Super 35mm from now on, as it sounds nicer, and I'm not going to count the ZV-E10. With a price that's close to half of the FX3, that's pretty aggressive pricing. And if you can do what the FX3 does, albeit with a smaller sensor, then yeah, it's competing against the Blackmagic Pocket 6K Pro, a very popular camera with low-budget filmmakers. I pretty much moved past Super 35mm cameras though. Well, I thought I had, because I am in the middle of an epic long-term review of the Fuji X-H2S, which I really rather like. That won't be finished for a while, for reasons which will become apparent quite soon. There's a lot more shooting that I need to do for it. Whereas the X-H2S review has lovely footage from New York, this review was all shot near me. There's actually something quite good about that, as most of my reviews do feature footage from the same areas, so it gives you a nice bit of continuity, so you can look at how shots compare with different cameras. Although, to be fair, most of them end up looking the same after grading. Part of the reason why this review is not as long as others is it's difficult for me to film with this sort of setup. I've got very bad back problems still, and I have sciatica at the moment, which is sharp, very painful all the way down from just above my, well, down my lower back on the right hand side, all the way down inside of my leg, around to the front of my leg into my foot. And it makes just standing really painful. So I'd love to run around and get loads of shots, but it's very hard. That's why doing reviews of things like drones and 360 cameras is a lot easier right now. Now there's a number of differences between the FX30 and FX3. The body itself is pretty much identical, except one says FX3, one says FX30, but they've removed the mechanical shutter in the FX30. The FX3 has it. You don't need this for video, just for stills. But the FX3's photability was the same as the A7S III's, which is very good. And now the FX30 is most definitely not. The rolling shutter of the FX30 is not as good as the FX3, so only being able to use the electronic shutter is not good for moving subjects. On top of that, for some reason, you can only take single photos. There's no continuous shooting mode. And I've no idea why, as my other mirrorless Sonys can all do continuous using electronic shutter. It's a shame, as the megapixels for photos is 26.1 megapixels compared to the FX3's 12.1. So with its high megapixels, the FX30 oversamples its 4K from 6K, and it does this up to 60p. It can shoot 4K 100 and 120p, but it has to crop in to do that, and I'll go into that in more detail shortly. The full-frame FX3, like its semi-twin, the Alpha 7S3 or A7S3, however you want to call it, is a low-light beast, with a dual ISO of 812,800. The FX30 is not at all in this same class. The ISOs are 800 and 2500. So far this video has been mostly about what the FX30 doesn't have compared to the FX3. But it actually has a lot of things that the FX3 doesn't have. And some of these are very important features. You can use the FX30 for streaming. There's no need for a capture card or adapter, just plug it straight into your computer via USB-C. But I haven't tried that though. The next one is a big one. Focus breathing control, which is also in the Alpha 7 IV, Alpha 7R5 and the FX6. If you own any of the Sony GM primes, you need this. When you pull focus on most of them, you get substantial breathing, and it makes it look like you're zooming. As you can see, there is a crop when it's engaged. How much depends on the lens and how much it breathes. Not all Sony lenses support this. There is a list on their website, and no third-party lenses work with this either. Now you can also do this in Sony's Catalyst Prepare software. You need to have stabilization off to get the best results and have in-camera breathing compensation off, of course. The advantages are you can decide how perfect the correction is. Sometimes it looks too clinical and too perfect. And also when using this, the crop will likely be less, as it's just going to correct for what it needs in that focus pull that you've got. Whereas in camera it covers the whole range, from minimum to infinity. Moving on to autofocus, and if you want to learn how to fully master this very powerful feature, then you must watch my 2-part video autofocus masterclass that I made for Sony. It took me 9 months to make this. It was so complicated and so in-depth, and it will make you fully understand the system and how to use it properly, how to take control and get great results. Sensitivity at 1 is what I would call the very stubborn AF mode. And I use it a lot, especially for talking heads. It's just if the AF loses the subject, it may be too stubborn to reacquire it. In these shots, at 1:1, I start with focus locked onto her, which is instantly going to help. When she walks behind the trees, because we are set to stubborn sensitivity, it won't move onto the tree, but it does lose her eye occasionally. When she fully appears from behind the tree, it manages to grab her again. If you try and do this shot with a fast sensitivity, the results are not good at all. As soon as it loses her, it goes straight onto the tree. When using tracking, remember the 4 S's: sensitivity, sensitivity, and sometimes speed. I wouldn't say the FX30's autofocus is better than the FX3's with its ability to track. I haven't done any side-by-sides, but it has some really important key improvements. One of the key things I didn't realise had actually been added to the FX3 with the version 2 firmware, and that is AF Assist, and I can see no reason to ever turn this off. But what it does is keep the manual focus barrel of the lens working during autofocus. Most other cameras turn it off. With this, you can override the autofocus by just turning the lens barrel. It's helpful if it's struggling to grab the subject you want, and it will also cancel any touch tracking that you've got. Sadly, I can't get it to work with any of my third-party lenses, just my Sony lenses. Fingers crossed it's just a firmware thing for those guys to update so it can work with it. Focus map is an interesting feature. It's a bit like false color for focus. When you have your subject in focus, they are clear. The colder colors over the image mean they are further away from your focus point, and the warmer ones, they are closer. It's not something I really use, but it's there. A much more important feature for me is the inclusion of eye autofocus for animals and birds in video. It's a huge thing for me, huge thing, for obvious reasons, but also when I do feel wildlife, which is a fair bit. Having this feature is a very important thing. And of course, it's in here, as you would expect, because it's a new camera. It did a pretty good job with my cats, although it didn't like Jimmy the Greek that much. But autofocus has never liked solid black subjects. Lollipop's lighter fur meant it had no issues. Sebby was fine, her eyes tend to be quite open. And my Siamese boys, Bert and Percy, were mostly fine. Even lovely Harriet's missing eye was recognised. With human mode, it will recognise heads as well as eyes, but not with animal and bird AF. It just recognises the eyes. Taking it out to Richmond, testing it on the pigeons, the swans, the ducks, the geese, was mixed results. The problem is that need to see the eye. The head isn't enough, it needs the eye, and if it loses that eye, when it's got the tracking, it can actually sometimes jump onto the background, which it absolutely shouldn't do because I had my AF sensitivity set to 1, which is the locked on mode. My Canon R5 and Fuji X-H2S will recognize face and body too, so if it loses the eye, it can still track. It just switches to the head and then the body. In fact, the new AI autofocus system in the A7R5 also does this. In fact, it has a much more advanced autofocus system, which I will cover in my review of that camera. So it's not perfect, but it's still better than not having it at all. I think you know what I'm hinting at here, but I will leave the rants till later on. Let's try and stay positive for now. Despite the dreadful back pain, I always love filming in Richmond. It's really therapeutic mentally, because it is the most beautiful part of London. It's my home and also home to some of the greatest living people, and lots of super posh ones too. I too now feel very posh, thanks to Established Titles, the sponsor of this video. I bought a title pack which gave me my own land in Scotland, and because of the historic custom there, I can now be referred to as Lord or Laird, to use the Scottish term, Philip Bloom. I'm currently in the process of changing my name on all sorts of different things like social media, my bank account, the dozen or so dating apps that I'm on, to Lord Philip Bloom. I'm allowed to. Not only am I now better than all my friends and family, Established Titles works with the global charities One Tree Planted and Trees for the Future to support global reforestation efforts. For each order, they will plant a tree. Whilst my plot of land may not be huge, I'm not that worried, because I've always been told, Philip, don't worry, it's not the size that counts. And so I decided to build my dream home on it. And here it is. It's quite nice, isn't it? Actually, scrap that. I've just read that you can't build on your land because they want to preserve the natural habitat, which is fair enough, but I've built my house. This is a great gift for someone that you feel is worthy of such an honour, with that added bonus of helping to preserve the natural woodlands of Scotland. And the first 200 people who purchase a title pack using my link will effectively become my neighbours, which is going to be really helpful when I need someone to feed my cats. One of the FX30's biggest weaknesses is also one of its biggest strengths. Wait for the train. When I film at home, I've got the planes. When I film here, I've got the trains. I like the trains there. Super 35mm sensor. APS-C sensor, what do you call it, but it is a cinema camera, is what we're calling it, so we're going to call it Super 35mm sensor, which means it's not full frame, which means everything is going to be 1.5 times field of view on our lenses. Now, this isn't ideal, obviously, if we are using a full frame camera and we want them to match and stuff, but if you need a tighter shot, then actually this is very useful for that. So yeah, it can definitely be considered a weakness, and I think it is a weakness, but that's why you're paying a lot less for it than the FX30. But then there's the strength. There's the fact that you can be closer in on subjects, which is one of the biggest downsides for me about the FX3, the A7S3, and the FX6, is because there is no Super 35mm mode. I love that ability to switch between them that the Alpha 1 has, and things like the Alpha 7R4, etc. have. Any camera that has that ability to go into Super 35mm mode as well. The FX30 has 4K 100, 120p, as well as having it in S&Q mode. It doesn't have the processing power to oversample the sensor to get this, so it does a 1:1 crop instead. It's about a 1.5 times crop, so that's a 1.5 times crop of a 1.5 times crop of full frame. That's not really fair, is it? The FX3's crop is much less, it's 10%, and like the FX3, you cannot use the active stabilization when in 100 and 120 frames per second. There are a couple of upsides though. If you do need to go tighter and you don't have the glass for it, then it's like a 1.5 times extender without the light and quality loss that the optical one will give you. You could use this even if you don't want the shot to slow motion, but if you do that, just make sure your shutter speed is as low as you can go to get the better motion blur. It does mean your files are bigger, but if you shoot in the XAVCHS codec, which is the H.265 one, then it's very efficient. I don't understand why they still don't let you use this codec for normal speed frame rates. Another way to get an extra 1.5 times on your field of view is to use clear image zoom, but then your autofocus only works in the most basic mode, no subject or touch tracking. Despite the crop and it's not being oversampled, I still think the image looks really nice. I like to shoot in the 4K 100 and 120p rather than the S&Q version of those because it gives me audio. If you want to go to 200 and 240 frames per second, you do need to use S&Q mode, and that is in 1080p. It doesn't look anywhere near as nice as even the normal HD, let alone the 4K of course. It's softer, noisier, and line skipped. But if you've been paying attention to some of the earlier shots, then it can look good if you use Topaz Video Enhance AI, which I think I mention in every single video because I do use it in every single video, and the difference that it makes to these shots is enormous. I never used the Alpha 7S3 or the FX6's 240 frames per second because of this problem until I put it through Topaz. The difference is night and day. It's not just cleaned up, it's also upscaled. The IBIS feels very much like the other Sony cameras. Wouldn't find it any worse or any better. The version 2 firmware for the FX3 made the camera much better. It made it feel much closer to the cinema line, the FX6 and the FX9, although why it's still missing waveforms, why it's still missing shutter angle, DCI, noise reduction, ability to change that, I don't know. These, for me, feel like obvious inclusions. I don't want to complain too much. I just did though, and I will continue. But not right now. The following all apply to the FX32. We have a new screen layout in video mode, which is so much cleaner and removes things we don't need to see because they are for stills mode. The A7R5 also has this. Now there is one downside to it, and that is the display does not show if you are in phase priority autofocus or which type of subject you have. I do think they need to address that, as it is important to see on your screen. And there does appear to be a bit of space on the bottom right they could put it in. Actually next to the type of autofocus you're in, makes more sense. There needs to be the ability to control what you put on the screen, because there are a number of things which could be useful for people to have on there, like if you have stabilization on, and when you're not in Cine EI, telling you which picture profile you're in. There's a quick tile menu. The A7R5 again has this. It reminds me a bit of the FX6's quick menu, although that one is accessible whilst recording, not on these cameras. A terrific addition is the ability to use proper timecode with the FX3 and FX30 using the catchily named VMC, BNC, M1 adapter. When I connect it up to my tentacle sync using the BNC cable, the camera receives the timecode from it and locks onto it. You cannot send timecode out of the camera, you can only receive it. It uses the multi-USB port of the camera, which isn't ideal as it's probably the most fragile connection on the camera, but they couldn't have used the USB-C as we need that for power delivery. You should leave it connected while shooting to avoid drift, but because of my worry about it being damaged, I personally would unplug it most of the time, just keep putting it back on every now and then to make sure the timecode is still locked on. You could get a universal clamp for your cage of course, if you want to leave it on the whole time. I've made a whole video about the importance of timecode, which is really worth watching, as it will transform your workflow for using more than one camera or using external audio. The single biggest thing that the version 2 firmware added is Cine EI mode. And no, the A7R5 does not have this, even though that's a newer camera, because this is very much a cinema camera feature. If you are going to shoot an S-Log3, then this is the way to do it. In the log shooting menu, you have flexible ISO, Cine EI Quick and Cine EI. Now this is a really complex topic, and I recommend watching some dedicated videos about this, which I will link in the description. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about this just to confuse you. You can still shoot an S-Log3 the traditional way in the picture profiles, but the best way of doing it is from the log part of the menu, even if you don't use the Cine EI part. Flexible ISO in the log menu is just like shooting an S-Log3 from the picture profile, except you have a big benefit. You can use LUTs, there's some in there, but you can upload your own. And the key thing is when you plug in a monitor, it outputs that LUT from the HDMI. If you're using the pitch profile one, then you only have the view assist, which does not go out of the HDMI, which has always been a big frustration. In Cine EI mode, you can only record in either 800 or 2500 ISO, the base ISOs, which are by far the cleanest because they are the base ISOs. You need to manually switch between the low and the high yourself, so add that to the function menu for speed. Cine EI Quick will do it for you. You just move up the exposure index and it will move on to the high. Also, make sure you have your log LUT turned on, otherwise what you're going to see is going to really confuse you. When you've enabled the LUT and you start changing your exposure index, it looks like you're shooting normally. You aren't. When you bring your clips into post, you'll see everything at the base ISO that you shot at. If you turn the ISO dial, you're just changing the exposure index, but you do make changes to your aperture and ND to compensate when you do that. So when you look at it in post, it's going to be either under or overexposed. So to make it look correct, you're going to need to color correct it. But the easiest way by far, especially for beginners, is to use Sony's Catalyst Prepare software, which annoyingly isn't free. But what it does is it automatically changes the image to the metadata. There is a plug-in version for Premiere of this, which is much more convenient than having to use a separate piece of software, but I couldn't get it to work as it stopped my Premiere from loading up any media, both in the latest version and the previous version of Premiere. I really recommend learning about Cine EI and how it works and what it does, because it will give you the best results from this camera, because it does avoid all of those nasty ISOs. Well, actually, there's not that many, not compared to the FX3, but it's definitely the best way to shoot S-Log3. There is one small caveat. If you're the sort of person who uses auto white balance, why are you? It doesn't work in Cine EI. Sorry. As you can hopefully see, the FX30 is a powerful camera stuffed full of really impressive features. If it had an EVF, I could be tempted, but it doesn't, and I don't think they can fix that with firmware. I'll get onto that. EVFs are so important. If you've never shot with one, why the hell not? It means you start shooting at proper height rather than holding it down below. That's no good. The LCD screens of the FX3 and FX30 are just too small and not bright enough. The built-in EVFs of the A7S3, etc., they're incredible. You're part of the image. You can tell when you're in focus, and it gives you more stability with that point of contact. I did ask Sony if they could make a version of the old RX1 EVF for the MI shoe in a couple of my reviews. This is my Portkeys Leye, L-E-Y-E, EVF. And it really works well with it. For some reason, there's hardly any budget EVFs out there, but thankfully this is a very good one. It's powered either by an external source or via a Canon LPE6 battery. My mount here, which I've cobbled together from all sorts of bits and pieces, isn't perfect, but it works pretty well because it gives me the ability to adjust the position of the EVF pretty much where I want it to be, which makes it way more practical than even if the FX30 had a built-in EVF. I do think that the XLR handle is a good accessory to get. It is more robust than the standalone XLR adapter you can buy called the XLR K3M. That is attached to the MI shoe on the top, and you really must never pick it up from that, although it's very tempting to do it. Interestingly, something I didn't know that I found out recently is you can get a little adapter from SmallRig for other cameras like the A7S3, as long as you've got one of the right cages that it works with, which lets you attach the XLR handle onto it. So if you've been missing the XLR handle and you really want it on your Alpha, then you can. Then the downside is it takes all of the mounting points away from the top of those cages, which is a bit of a pain. So this is more or less the end of the FX30 review. As you can tell, it's been a pretty positive one. So what is all the rest of this time here? And where's the rant? Well, here it is. The FX30 has more advanced features in it than the almost twice as expensive FX3. And these are software features. I'm not talking about any hardware features. These are things which could be put in it. You know, the animal eye autofocus, the focus breathing, which is so important. These are key things which are missing from it. And they shouldn't be missing from it. They should be in there. And this brings me on to the other cameras that these should be in. And let's start with the flagship camera, the Alpha 1. The most expensive mirrorless camera that they make. And I love it. It's my favorite camera. Let me just concentrate on the animal eye autofocus part, because there's something about this which has really frustrated me. I've not been able to get a straight answer from Sony, an answer at all, about this simple question. And that is, why do we have the option to select animal eye autofocus in video if it doesn't work in these cameras like the Alpha 1 and the Alpha 7S3? It's in there. Look at the icon, because it shows that this is a video feature. A feature that is just stills will have just a camera icon, and one is just video will just have the little film icon. One that has both means it works in both, but it doesn't. But it's been there ever since day one of the Alpha 7S3. Why? For me, it just felt like it's there in anticipation of it being added with firmware. But we're talking, getting on to really 2.5 years since that camera came out, and not a sign of it. Why? Why is it so hard to add this feature in there? A precedent has already been set about updating cameras to give this feature to them, because 2 cameras have been updated and now have it. But we're not talking the Alpha 7S3 or Alpha 1, we're talking the Alpha 7C and the ZV-E10 of all cameras. They've received firmware update to give it animal eye autofocus, but not the flagship and not the Alpha 7S3. I don't understand why. There is no logic to that. Is there? The AF assist function that was added in the version 2 firmware for the FX3 and is in all subsequent cameras is an incredibly important thing that we need to control the autofocus. Once you've had a camera with it, you'll go, well, how on earth did I cope with this before? I don't know why it doesn't work with third-party lenses, but the most important thing is it needs to be added to the flagship camera and the Alpha 7S3. I can live without the focus map, I don't use it, but breathing control is so key. Not having that on the flagship and the Alpha 7S3 is bizarre. We have these fantastic new GM primes, but they breathe like crazy. And once you've used the breathing control, you'll be like, oh, yes, every camera needs to have this. And they really should. We have focus breathing control on right now. Hand. Look at the frame. Good, isn't it? Hand. Now let me turn it off. Hand. Hand. Which one looks better? I think we both know the answer to that. It's this one. Incorrect. It was the one before, with focus breathing control on. We need this in the Alpha 1, the flagship camera, and the Alpha 7S3, and the FX3, please. These people saying you can't put it in the FX3, you can't put it in the A7S3, there's not enough resolution. Nonsense! It's in the FX6, and that has the same sensor. I know I'm not the only person who feels this way. I ran a poll on one of the Facebook groups, and yeah, I mean, obviously it was a no-brainer question, and the people who actually chose the second option is very bizarre, but it just shows you we want our cameras to be updated. It's not just me in little old Brexit land UK, it's in Europe, it's around the world. We all want our Alpha 1s, our Alpha 7S3s and FX3s to be updated. They even want this in Canada.
Why are you dragging me into this mess, Philip? But you're right, I am also frustrated at the way that Sony's been handling, or rather not handling, their firmware updates. Yeah, I'm all in on Sony's system, predominantly because of lenses. You know, you find a system that you think that you're gonna be happy with, and then you start stocking up on lenses, and that's what I've done. And I like Sony's lens collection and also third-party support for lenses, so I'm happy with the fact that I'm using Sony for my needs. But it frustrates me that it's, you know, I can understand it. I understand how there's more money and more development in new cameras than there is in firmware updates. And I also understand that development is hard and that often there's a lag. You know, us as end users and also as reviewers, we see things that we want and then we complain about them, and other users complain about things, and then a new camera comes out and we don't see those things and we think nobody's listening. When in reality, that camera that just came out has probably been planned in its current state for a couple years, so it's already, it has nothing to do with the complaints that we made since then. So there is a big lag, like a big lag. But when it comes to firmware, that's how you can sort of fight back against that lag if you put adequate staff and resources toward developing it. And I'm also okay with not getting everything in every camera, you know? But with Sony, it almost seems like it's working the opposite way. It's a great way to sell a new camera when it's cheaper and you say, hey, look, this one's got everything the more expensive camera does. And we've also often criticized companies for not doing that out of fear of cannibalizing their own market share. So I'm torn because I appreciate when cheaper cameras can do all the things that bigger cameras can do. Maybe that's the loophole there. The what's frustrating about Sony is that it's not that they're making cheaper cameras that can do everything the more expensive cameras can do. It's that the more expensive cameras can't do the things. So that's the only thing that needs to be done, and then we're happy all the way down the line. You want the FX30, you want the FX3, you want the A1, you want the FX6. You're not... I'm gonna say the same thing I said in so many videos. It's the flagship. The A1 is the flagship. So if you come up with a good idea after the A1, but you know, not 5 years after, but just months after, you gotta go back and you gotta put it in the A1, and you have to dedicate enough resources to do that right away so that A1 users don't feel left out, and people like me don't feel stupid for getting the A1, recommending the A1, making multiple videos on the A1, but then every other camera that comes out for half as much or a quarter as much have these new features that I also say are great, but they're not in the A1 that I recommend. It makes me look dumb, it just makes everybody look... Yeah, you're right, I am frustrated. So, it just feels like an easy fix. And I think the argument against, with certain limitations, a company like Sony could figure it out. So really, it's the A1. It's what, their fastest stacked best thing ever. So put the damn focus breathing compensation and whatever else you want that's in an $1,800 camera, stick it in that camera. Stick it in it. Do it. That's all I have to say. All right. I'm done.
I know it comes down to resources, and I know that new cameras are going to be more of a priority than updating older ones for people who've already spent the money. But it comes down to customer loyalty. It comes down to us knowing that investment is going to last. And we know our investment's going to last when you update the firmware and give them absolutely key features which are purely software based, and they can be added. It should not be a side thing of something which, oh, we'll get that done at some point. It should be a priority as much as putting these features into new cameras. I'd also love to have the new layout that we have in the FX30, the FX3 and the R5. For that video, it's so clean and so nice. Can we have that as well? I don't think I'm asking for too much, because these aren't massive things. I'm not asking you to add things which none of the cameras have. You know, I'd love to have waveform, DCI, all of these things. I'd love for the LCD to stay on when I have the output display on the monitor. I like all of these things. I know these can be hardware issues. So what I'm asking for are software things I know you can do. You can put it in the Alpha 7.4. You can put it in your flagship, can't you? Surely. Anyway, that's enough ranting. It's got a bit darker now. Camera still looks okay though. It's a really nice camera. Oh dear, this was my review of the FX30. I like it. Way more than I thought I would.